Right now, the jury in the Michael Slager trial is deliberating for another day in Charleston, South Carolina. This after a lone juror refused to convict the ex-police officer, saying in a note to the judge, quote, "I still cannot without a reasonable doubt convict the defendant. I cannot and will not change my mind." And just moments ago, the judge took questions from the jurors. So let's talk about this. With me now is CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Laura Coates. Thanks for being here, Laura.
Thank you.
So this lone juror, what if this lone juror cannot, he says he won't change his mind. So does that mean it's a hung jury and it's a retrial?
It could very well mean that. I mean, you have this requirement that verdicts be unanimous, and we do that because out of fairness of justice, we want to have people have unanimous verdicts. And, it's the one thing that a prosecutor is always afraid of, that little seed of reasonable doubt. And that same seed of doubt is what a defense attorney will hold on to for dear life. And remember, Carol, you've got 55 witnesses over a 5-week period. There's always room for reasonable doubt. You and I and the rest of the world have seen this videotape, and it seems to lead no other conclusion other than guilt. However, all you need is one juror to have enough doubt to say, listen, I think that this is inappropriate. And remember, that note from the juror goes on to talk about, listen, I don't expect my other jurors to follow my thinking or change their minds, and my heart does go out to the Scott family, that note says, but there is a seed of reasonable doubt for this juror.
Okay, and just to refresh our viewers' memories, this ex-officer, he was fired over this shooting, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He stopped a man named Walter Scott because Walter Scott had this broken taillight. There was some sort of altercation. I don't know what it was, but Walter Scott got out of his car. He turned around and started running. The officer shot at him 8 times. Mr. Scott was struck 5 times, 3 times in the back. And there's really no evidence of any physical altercation between the two men, correct?
Right, and even if you were to believe former officer Michael Slager that there was an altercation between the two men, 18 feet went by between the two men before he actually shot at or Mr. Scott. And I have to say, that's the part that people find completely unreasonable for anybody to find any sort of doubt here. 18 feet apart was when the officer first shot at Walter Scott. And remember, even the local union refused to pay this officer's legal fees in this case, which normally is a real big signal that the officers aren't behind you either. But here, we seem to have a juror who says, listen, there is something about this case that I don't find reasonable. And I think, Carol, one of the things that may be happening is the prosecution allowed the jury to examine or consider voluntary manslaughter in addition to murder, which leaves a little bit of room for a juror to say, well, maybe the government's not convinced that this was somebody acting out of malice. There's some kind of room for us to doubt. And maybe that's the reason this juror is holding out.
Well, the officer in this case did take the stand, which is quite unusual. Usually lawyers don't allow their clients to take the stand, but in this case, maybe it worked.
What else could he have done? I mean, you've got the video. Their whole defense essentially was, I know you've seen the video. I know that with your own eyes, all you see is this narrative of a man who was shot in the back, shot at 8 times. But listen, I had a fear for my life. I was afraid that this man would come back towards me with a taser, which of course doesn't really execute lethal force, but a taser, and I had to act appropriately. And so his last line of defense was to take that stand. And Carol, it may have just worked. But there is a possibility with an 11-1 holdout in favor of conviction that any reasonable prosecutor would re-bring this case. And again, in January, there's a federal trial against this same former officer for civil rights violations.
Laura Coates, thanks for your insight. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.